folks off of one of the planes whose body was identified and was being shipped back by train for burying. This is one of the pieces of airmail that was recovered. The Postal Service in those days actually, when they recovered mail from aircraft crashes, which unfortunately happened fairly regularly back then, they would put a little note on it saying it was damaged in transit, and they'd send it on. And believe it or not, there's still some of these floating around on online auctions. You'll occasionally see one to this day, and this is one of the actual pieces of mail from the 1956 Grand Canyon crash. Again, here's another picture of the two locations. We talked about the TWA site. They were able to get to it pretty readily, and they were able to recover all the bodies within a couple days. They carried out 27 bags worth of remains from that site. And the United was a different story. Like I mentioned, it crashed very near the top of a cliff, basically a 1,000-foot cliff. And that 1,000-foot cliff was already way up off the river, with a pretty steep slope here. And there were a lot of folks, including a lot of park rangers at the time, who thought that the United wreck site would never be reached, and none of those folks would ever be recovered. This part of the canyon was very remote. Neither of these buttes, I don't believe, had actually been climbed to the top in those days. And it was thought by many people that these bodies would remain there forever, and some folks thought that was a good idea. There was a boyfriend of one of the young nursing students, actually a recent graduate of nursing school, who said that he couldn't think of a more beautiful place for his girlfriend to remain. But as it turned out, not only to recover the bodies if possible, but also to recover the aircraft wreckage so that they could try and find out what happened and prevent future crashes, an effort was made, quite a determined effort to get to this wreck site, and they were eventually successful. There were a couple of attempts, a couple of avenues taken to try and get to this crash site. And one of them involved a United Airlines climbing team out of Colorado. United had a plane go down into near the top of a mountain in Medicine Bow, Wyoming, not too long before this crash. And they had a heck of a time getting up there, so they had actually put together their own company mountaineering team. And this is the cliff that they were trying to get up here. This is a picture that I took when I went out to the crash site back in April. And the plane hit right up in this area, and most of the wreckage spilled down the front. And so this United team just started climbing up, but they were used to granite rock and climbing in the Rockies. And the sedimentary rock out here was, a lot softer and, as to their perspective, more treacherous, more difficult climbing than what they were used to. So they made it part way up. They recovered 3 bodies at the base of this cliff, in fact, and they were having a tough time with it. In the meantime, the president of United Airlines had contacted the president of Swiss Air and asked him for his help, because the Swiss were world-renowned mountain climbers back in those days. And there was a Swiss rescue team that was believed to have the only wire harness equipment that might be able to deal with the situation. So they were flown over, and they got there just a day or two after the United climbing team started going up, and this is one of the Swiss climbers in the door of this helicopter here, right as they were arriving to help. And the Army was able to helicopter a couple of these guys to the top of that cliff. They dropped lines down, hooked up with the United climbers, and they actually worked together for the next 4 days in recovering the wreckage and the remains from out of that cliff. What they did was they actually constructed a wire cat's cradle, basically, and lowered people down into this mass of wreckage. From any distance, it almost looked like tinfoil or metal confetti. And I talked by email to one of the guys who was there, and he said in actuality what this was sharp pieces of metal, literally miles and miles of cable that if you took a wrong step, you could do some serious injury to yourself, even on the few level parts of it. This picture over on the left is an aerial view, obviously looking down at the very top of the cliff, the wreckage down this way, and then right there is one of the big Army helicopters down on the sandbar below. Once they were able to recover some key pieces of the wreckage, and actually even before that, they had a pretty good idea what had happened. As soon as people got to the TWA site, they took a look at the paint scheme. They knew the paint scheme, which was very similar to this aircraft over here. It was basically white with some red on it. And the only blue on it, the entire aircraft, was on the blue part of the American flag, which was a very small part of the aircraft. The first thing that the people that got to the TWA site had noticed was that there were pieces of this white aircraft with cut marks, and you can see some of those recreated right up here. They were finding cut marks on these broken pieces of this TWA airplane, and in these cut marks there was blue paint. And that's why I mentioned those propellers earlier. It was later determined that the red, white, and blue spinners, or the tips of the propellers on the United plane had made those cuts. This shows some of the investigators on another Super Constellation airliner recreating these cuts on the fuselage. And here you can see the spinners that I was talking, or the propeller tips I was talking about down here, how they made these red, white, and blue circles. This is the actual wingtip of the United aircraft, and these are pieces of the TWA aircraft. And they found, when they started piecing them together, that it was an exact fit. And it was also found that there were pieces of one airliner embedded in pieces of the other at each of the two crash sites. So, it was pretty obvious from very early on, July 1st or July 2nd, that there had been a mid-air collision. But these folks not only confirmed that, but the CAB investigators were able to recreate exactly what had happened in quite a bit of detail. This is one of the crashes that led to the implementation of the black boxes on board airliners, the cockpit voice recorders and the flight data recorders. The technology had been around for a while before this crash, but as Senator Hubert Humphrey was quoted as saying in a newspaper shortly after this crash, the reason that these black boxes, or the early equivalents, weren't on the aircraft at the time of this crash is because it would have cost a whole $2,000 per aircraft to put them on board, and that was just not considered feasible.